Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. So this is probably about one of the last things before the weekend. So I appreciate the effort. So the program today is that I thought I would say a few words about the exam, and I can follow that up with an email that I would ask to send to everyone, just that summarizes what is the expectation. And then I will respond to any questions that the students may have arising out of the last class. So if you have any questions, then do please jot them down on in the chat function. Or if you don't have questions, if you just have some comments or some observations that you'd like to share, then please do that. And then finally, we will move into the substantive part of today's program, which is the seminar. So I will make a few introductory comments, and then we will split into the two workout areas, and we will be in those for about 40 minutes. So we have some students who will be leading this. I will be in one of the breakout sessions, and Dr. Gao will be in the other one. And then we will come back and we will ask the students to report back, to summarize and to highlight some of the issues that were discussed. And then we'll have a wider conversation among the whole class. So that is the program for today. And then I would like to see if there were any questions or any comments arising out of the last lecture. So if maybe we just pause for a couple of minutes, and if anyone has any comments, if they could just jot them down in the chat function. Now, thank you. So I see that there are no questions or comments that have been provided yet, but I'm sure people are writing their own comments. So please continue to do that. And if we have time at the end, we can always revisit this, or otherwise we can talk about them at the next class. Actually, I noticed that there's one question from with regard to some of the practical aspects of, I guess, funding and the financial aspects. So we will be looking at this next week. We have a class that's dedicated to the funding of institutions and another one to the financing activities. And an interesting comment about the privatization of IFIs. So I'm not aware of the privatization of any international financial institution. Certainly not of any major one. Maybe there's a small regional or a sub-regional financial institution that has been privatized. I'm not aware, but there will be, if you have an organization particularly in mind, it'd be good to share that. I am aware of bilateral organizations, so official organizations of governments that have then privatized. So there's been like development agencies of states which have then been privatized. So it's interesting to study those. Maybe there are insights that are relevant for any consideration of privatizing international financial institutions. But I'm not aware of any. I'd be curious to hear about the arguments in favor of such an approach. But a very interesting thought. Thank you very much. So let's move on to the substantive part of today's program, which is the seminar. So I'm not very good at maths. I said that there would be 3 questions, but in fact I only gave you 2. So my apologies for that, but it's not very important. So we're going to, over the remainder of today's session, we're going to be considering the issues that I have suggested we discuss, and they break out into 2 broad areas. So the first is really looking at the way in which mainly the members, but also in some instances the non-members, extend a sort of privileged treatment to international financial institutions. So they endow them with certain exemptions, certain privileges, certain immunities, and these are provided for in the charters of the institution, but some members will also provide additional special treatment. This is particularly so in relation to the country which is hosting the headquarters of the institution, but it may also be the case with countries that are hosting a resident office of the institution. So privileges and immunities are a little bit under attack, I would say, at the domestic level. I think this is partly a reflection of just the state of world politics, that in recent years, many influential countries have become quite nationalistic, and when you become nationalistic, then it's hard to promote the virtues of multilateralism. And of course, international financial institutions are very much associated with multilateralism. And the privileges and immunities sort of reflect a multilateralist mindset. And so if at the domestic level, these things are being questioned or are not so highly valued, then one casualty is that privileges and immunities can come under greater scrutiny, and not just scrutiny from a perspective of whether the privileged treatment is appropriate, but also scrutiny from the perspective of whether there should be full enforcement, at least from the way in which the IFI would see it, of the treatment that the IFIs enjoy. And so this can play out, as we saw in discussions about jurisdictional immunity. Why should a domestic court not deal with complaints against an international financial institution in the same way as they would about complaints against any other party? Or maybe in the area of tax. So we're going to discuss next week the International Civil Service Statement, or the International Civil Service status of IFI employees. So as a general rule, they're exempted from paying tax, but it's not an easy argument to maintain in a hostile environment, and therefore there are sometimes efforts to tax the compensation of IFI employees. So it's good, I think, for us as a class to just reflect on not only what are the elements of the special treatment that's been accorded by the members in particular, but also potentially by others. For example, in the Paris Club, when it comes to rescheduling of debts, but also, what are the underlying reasons for according this special treatment, and do they always hold? Do they hold in today's environment? So that's the sort of background to the first question that I've asked, and I look forward to the discussion in the breakout sessions and in the plenary session that will follow. And then the second question is really about membership. And so obviously, it's important to become a member of an international financial institution if you expect to receive financial support from it. We spoke yesterday about some exceptional circumstances where some institutions can support non-members. We noted that at the IBRD, the excess profits from time to time have been used to support activities and non-members, and we looked specifically at the case of Palestine and how that was justified in the legal opinion at the time as being something that was in the benefit of all of the members. So that's how that was justified there. In the case of the AIIB, we observed that there is a provision in the Charter that enables the bank to invest in a non-member country in certain exceptional circumstances, provided that the highest governance body approves that approach. And there's a process there that calls for a very high voting threshold if that route is to be followed. So there are extraordinary instances where an international financial institution can invest outside of its membership. We also saw the AIIB is rather special because it can invest in projects outside of its regional members. It can invest in non-regional members, which is something that the other regional organizations can't do. So this, I think, is fairly obvious that if countries want to access the resources of an institution, they should become members. But why else do they become members? And why is it that the countries, and in some instances territories, that do not expect to benefit from access to the financial resources of the institution, why do they become members? And as we saw, apart from the AIIB, in the other major institutions, those countries are in the majority. So the IBRD and the major regional development banks are all owned and controlled by members who do not expect to borrow from the institution. So why is it that they become members of that institution? What are the motivations for those members organizing the international financial institution in the manner in which it is organized? And why is it that they equip the institution with the powers that it has, bearing in mind that this organization and these powers will not result in access to the financial resources of the institution for those members? So what is behind that? And so those kind of considerations are what prompted the kind of questions that you have here and which you're asked to discuss in the breakout session about what are the benefits of membership beyond access to finance. What about the profits that are accumulated, even though IFIs do not set out to maximize the wealth of their shareholders? They do strive to be financially sustainable. They are required to comply with sound banking principles. So achieving a profit is both normal and, I would say, over the longer term is a target. But what happens with profits that are accumulated? We saw that dividends have never been paid in the past, but why not? Should they be? Is there a danger in having too much by the way of accumulated profits residing in the institution? Or is it healthier for the institution if it is leaner and does not have such excess reserves, with the reserves being used differently, if not for dividends, then possibly by being reassigned to special funds to pursue some special interest of the institutions. And then finally, if a member decides that it no longer wishes to be a member, then think a little bit about the kind of considerations that might lead to that outcome. So we talked about at the World Bank how a number of countries left the institution during the time of the Cold War, although all of them, I think, came back. I think the exception is Cuba. I think at the other major regional development banks, I think it's a very rare thing for anyone to have left. I know at some of the smaller sub-regional banks, occasionally members leave, but it's an exception. I mean, the one that I always think of is that France did withdraw from the Caribbean Development Bank. But these are all very much exceptions, and as we saw, the exceptions tend to underscore the rule that members don't leave international financial institutions. They're very loyal, and they have a very long-term commitment to the institution. But nonetheless, if they do withdraw, then when the accounts are all settled, should the withdrawing member have access to their share, as it were, of the reserves, of the accumulated profits that have not been distributed. And in this regard, we noted that at some institutions, for example, the EBRD, a withdrawing member does not have access to those reserves. The most that they can receive from the institution when they leave is the amount that they paid in. And that in other institutions, for example, at the AIIB, under the Charter, we saw that if a member is withdrawing, then they receive the book value of their shares, which implies that they do receive a proportion of the accumulated profits. And we noted also that this could lead to some kind of peculiar outcomes depending on the price that was paid for the shares going in. So we observed in the lecture yesterday that the default rule under the various charters is that irrespective of the time of when new members join an institution, they will buy the shares at par value. So in an extreme case, one could have a member joining an institution one day, paying for its shares at par, and then the next day withdrawing from the institution and receiving not only its money back, but a percentage of the accumulated profits. Not very likely, but nonetheless, I mention it because it does underscore a point. So these are some of the considerations for you to reflect on as you discuss the second question. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction to the seminar. So we have about 40 minutes. Shall we make it 43 minutes so we have a round amount of time? And then we'll come back into plenary session. Thank you very much. So everyone, we are back in plenary session. I think most of us are, yes, back. Yeah, I think we're all back now. So I don't know how the other breakout session went, but our one was very interesting. And we probably could have done with much more time to go into things in a bit more detail, but we had a very good discussion. So I propose that we ask each of the two student leaders to provide us with a little bit of a summary of the discussions and the insights. And why don't we go one topic at a time? So first, let's discuss the special status of institutions, their privileges and immunities, and so forth. Let's discuss that question first. So, which breakout session would like to go first?
Maybe I can go first if the other leader doesn't
Okay.
mind. So, yeah.
Please.
In terms of the first big question pertaining to the immunities and exemptions and privileges, I think for the sub-question 1, we all came to the agreement that in principle, these IFIs, international financial organizations or institutions should only be subject to the international law rather than be subject to like the very different legal system of different countries. And also that also applies to the tax system, because one very prominent kind of reason Professor Gao brought up is that the tax money of these international financial institutions is everybody's money. It's the collective sum, right? So therefore, it should not be benefited. It should not only benefit one certain country, especially I guess this argument is more prominent because for organizations like IFS, they don't have any territory, right? So say AIIB is the headquarters is located in China. You can't just use everybody's money to pay for the tax money for the tax in China, because that would solely benefit the Chinese government, China, right? So I think that's like the reasons why we think these IFIs should only be subject to the international law rather than the domestic law, like the very different legal system and tax systems. And for the second sub-question, should IFIs enjoy jurisdictional immunity? We think obviously they should, because the jurisdiction immunity, first of all, the main purpose is to prevent the interference of different kind of sovereign states to interrupt. But there's also like something that we brought up is if there's a dispute with the private sector, so if a kind of private sector controversy happens, then the jurisdiction immunity will be limited, because as I said, the purpose of immunity is like predominantly set to prevent interference by a sovereign state. So that's that. And for the third sub-question, when is it appropriate to give IFIs preferential treatment over other creditors? We all find this question very tricky because it's very technical, but thankfully Professor Gao provided a very interesting point, and also it's like a historical context. So he brought up the Paris, like the gentleman agreement between the Paris Club and the developing countries. So when these developed countries who comprise the Paris Club lend money to developing countries, they said if in any event there's an economic crisis, you don't have to pay us back. You can prioritize the payment for the IFS. For one, because the IFS are doing like the good things for the collective community on a global or regional scale, and also because they have a more advantageous rates, meaning they're like the rate is lower, right? And also very interestingly, there's a conflicting well, not conflict, but overlapping interests, because it just happened that these developed countries are also the founding members of the some of the IFS who lent the money in the first place. So paying the money back to the IFIs also mean paying the money back to these developed countries in the Paris Club. So I guess that summarizes our discussion on question 1. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now can we hear the summary from the other group, please?
Okay, so I'm not sure how I should put these opinions together, but I think I should start. Concerning the tax exemption, we've discussed that the tax can offset the risk related to projects, so the tax should be provided. And people who who believe that there should be a tax exemption, that the tax exemption makes it more efficient, makes the capital of the member more efficient. And the country that is hosting the headquarters is actually benefited by the hosting organization. So I think Lauren said there should be a tax exemption. And regarding the jurisdictional immunity, there was this opinion that accountability should be considered. So they should enjoy the immunity in some extent. I mentioned GEM case, and I thought I guess the country was India, and the third parties that sued against the headquarters. Okay, let me put this together. Since projecting party there was this opinion that since projecting party is not matured enough, IFI should take the accountability rather than the projecting party. I think this is the conclusion. Sorry for being so not. Yes, I guess this is the conclusion. Sorry.
So maybe I can just add a couple of thoughts from the discussion and also reflecting a little bit on what I was saying with regard to the discussion in his group. We also talked about the tax situation in the context of employee taxes. And so initially, I think the impulse of some people in the breakout group was, well, of course, everyone should pay their fair share of taxes, and why should the IFIs be exempted? But then there was an acknowledgement that you have to be careful that you're not benefiting any one member when it is really the collective resources and effort that is generating the possibility of these taxes being paid. And then we thought about this further in the context of employees, and we thought, well, if employees were taxed, then what they get paid in gross terms would have to be much higher than what it currently is in order to enable them to pay taxes, so that the net amount that they get paid would make their incomes competitive. And then we were thinking of a host of an international organization that's headquartered in a country with a high taxing tradition, and concluded that this would mean that the payroll would be much greater than it would otherwise be. So the example I suggested was the Nordic Investment Bank in Helsinki. So the Scandinavian countries have very high taxes. So probably the amount that the members set aside for salaries would have to be doubled if they were going to be subject to local taxes. And if you did that, then the host country would reap a reward because they would collect all the taxes. But in fact, this would be paid for effectively by the rest of the members. And so that would be an unjust enrichment of the host country. And then we thought too that if you're an employee of one of these organizations, let's say you're working at the AIB for a full career, you're there for 30 years, and if you were paying taxes to the Chinese authorities, then you would expect that at the end of that period, you would be entitled to some kind of retirement benefit from the Chinese state, or during that 30-year period, you would be covered by the Chinese medical system. Or if you became unemployed, you would benefit from the Chinese social security system. But these things are not open to employees of international organizations. So then there would be a mismatch between paying all these taxes, but in fact not receiving any benefits from them. So that was, I guess, that went into our thinking about the importance of ensuring that all members of an organization are treated equally, and that not any one of them should be especially advantaged or especially disadvantaged because of these kind of considerations. And then I think just to expand on Zhu Yung's comment about the JAMS case, one of the questions that had arisen was, why didn't those who were making the complaint bring it against the local project players and the local government and the local sponsors and so forth, rather than the international financial institution? And I think here that in fact is probably what will happen, and in the ordinary course that is what would happen. Here I think that those who were bringing the complaint have a pretty high hurdle to overcome if they want to be successful, because they need to demonstrate, if they want to pursue the IFC, that they have jurisdiction in the US, or rather the US courts have jurisdiction over the case. So we saw that the Supreme Court said that there is no jurisdictional immunity, but that doesn't mean that the courts have jurisdiction. So the lower courts have to decide whether there is sufficient connection between the complaint that was made by those complaining and in relation to a project located in India, where there's a local sponsor and there's a local government which will have an important role to play in the implementation of the project that was being complained about, and the United States, which is where the headquarters is located. So is there a sufficient connection for the US to take jurisdiction? Probably there is not, because even the Supreme Court noted that the mere fact that the decision to invest is made in the US, that in and of itself is not enough to give the courts jurisdiction. But even if jurisdiction were made out, then those complaining would have to be able to demonstrate as a matter of law and as a factual matter that a lender is somehow liable for the decisions of those who are promoting and implementing projects. So that's not an easy case to make out, either legally or in terms of evidence. So but I think that the reason that they made the complaint against the IFC was not because these local farmers and others thought that they had a stronger case against the IFC, but probably it was the non-governmental organizations and civil service organizations who were acting on behalf of those complainants, who encouraged them to pursue the IFC. And they may have done that for a host of reasons. Some NGOs and CSOs just don't like the international financial institutions. Some of them don't particularly like some specific institutions. And there may also be a view that the international financial institutions have deep pockets. They have much more money than some of the parties who might be a more natural fit for being sued. And also, the international financial institution is probably much more transparent and may have higher standards and be a bit more accountable than would be the case, say, with a local government in some instances. So I think, I don't know in the GEMS case, what the motivations were for pursuing the IFC, but I imagine those are the kind of considerations that would have been relevant. So any final thoughts from the two, from nothing from Xiaolong, please?
No, I think I'm good actually.
Okay, and anything to add?
There's nothing to add. Thank you, Professor, for organizing the opinion.
No problem. So no, you organized it. I just helped it along a little bit. So let's move now to the second and final question. So shall we maintain the same order? Would you like to say something on this?
Yes, pleasure. So I think for the first question, what are the benefits of membership of an IFI beyond access to finance? I think we mainly came up with two merits other than the accessibility to financial resources. But the first one being, if you are affiliated to one, if you're the member of one organization, that might be conducive to your future affiliation to another membership. So I think one example that we covered in class is if you are the members of IBRD or ADB, you can also be a member of AIIB. And the second point is, well, apart from like the economic sphere, if these countries are all involved in one same membership, that can also promote political and also diplomatic ties, which can help strengthening their bond in the future, which also kind of correlates to like the very premise of IFIs, because that can help them build multilateral or bilateral bonds that can just contribute to, you know, either regionalism or globalism that helps a lot of, that is very like encapsulating in a way because it helps different areas. And then moving on to how should IFIs spend their money, be accumulating the profits, be distributing them as dividends, or like what kind of methods they should be using to like manage the financial resources. I think there's one, well, we thought there's no like one common answer that can be applied to all cases, because it is very crucial to look into the specific characteristics of the IFS that we're talking about, because some IFI are just more, I guess, commercial oriented. If that's the case, then maybe they should be distributing the money by dividends, because that can help the members. That can also incentivize the members to stay. But if for some other IFIs who are trying to help the society, or help help to elevate the poverty in some countries or areas, then it might be a good idea to accumulate the profits, because they don't really know when is the sudden big, financial crisis or economic shock is going to happen. Maybe they can use the accumulated profit to help with the situation. And that also, I think that also nicely linked to the second point, is that before we're even thinking of how to spend the money, we think it's likely insurance to have a nice big pool of financial resources to ensure when there's economic shock, for example, the Asian economic crisis or the sovereign debt crisis happens, then these IFIs actually have the capability to help this country. Yeah, I think that summarizes our discussion on question 2. Thank you.
So would you like to add something?
Okay, so we have discussed several benefits of membership, such as they can make their voice in international organizations and earn beneficial knowledge about other countries' economic situation. And they can also influence other countries' political development. And moving on to next point, we all agreed that IFI should accumulate profits for long-term perspective and use them when contingency happens, such as financial crisis or situations such as COVID. And finally, concerning dividends, there was an opinion that dividends might motivate countries to actively involve in the investment activities. So I guess this is all.
Thank you very much. I mean, one thing that I took out from our discussion in our breakout group that I thought was also interesting is that I think that members often join an institution because it's a way of contributing to a larger effort, even if the individual contribution is relatively modest. So you see that, for example, in the larger international financial institutions, that you can have some very small members who never expect to ever borrow and whose contribution must be to the organization must be quite minimal, but they want to be part of the effort. So I would say an example of that would be my own home country of New Zealand. It decided to become a member of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, even though it's as far away as possible from the region in which the EBRD was investing, which initially was Central Europe and the former Soviet countries. It's a larger investment area now, but that's how it was when New Zealand chose to join. And there was always open procurement at the EBRD. So if you expected to be able to bid on projects, you didn't have to be a member first. But I think New Zealand joined, like a lot of small countries who were not expecting to be able to contribute much and who were not expecting to benefit much either, just because they wanted to be part of a larger process. And in the case of the EBRD, it was established with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it was the triumph of certain liberal values over certain competing values. And there was a sort of form of peace dividend, as it were, and they wanted to be associated with that. So that's why they became a member. So I think sometimes there may be sort of more subtle explanations like that. And I think a more practical one, which we touched on in our team as well in our breakout session, is that the institutions over the years accumulate a vast amount of knowledge and insight about economic and other matters. And by being a member, it's a way to access that knowledge, or a better way to access that knowledge. And it may also be an easy way to receive sort of policy advice from the institution if one is a member of the organization. So that's all I wanted to contribute from my side. Maybe now I can ask Dr. Gao to provide some comments, and I invite you to say some comments about both questions, and then we will wrap up, please.
Thank you, Gerard. In the interest of the time, maybe I just share some general points about the first question, that is international organizations, their immunities. So international organizations, including IFIs, have to have immunities for many reasons. If they do not have immunities, member countries would be able to interfere with their business based on those member countries' national legal systems. So what would happen would be, say, the AIIB would have to look at about 100 national legal systems, and the United Nations would have to deal with about 200 national legal systems. So to keep their independence from interference from member countries, international organizations are, in principle, only subject to international law instead of very different national legal systems. However, international law is very often not as complete as national legal systems. So if international organizations enjoy 100% jurisdictional immunity, then there could be some gaps. So for example, individual people may be harmed by international organizations' operations. And if those international organizations, including IFIs, enjoy 100% jurisdictional immunity, there's a possibility that the victims will have nowhere to sue such international organizations. They will have nowhere to get the justice served. And that happened very often in the case of human rights abuses. So when it comes to a dispute of a private law character, particularly a human rights case, many national courts have accepted suits against international organizations, and including some regional courts, such as the European Court of Human Rights. But in general, jurisdictional immunities are supposed to protect international organizations from interference by member states, not really to protect international organizations from individual parties, from the private sector parties. So the purpose of immunity is to deal with public authorities, not really private sector entities, and not really individual human beings. Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gao. So any further comments or any further questions from anyone? So I think that was a very good discussion, both at in the breakout sessions, as I observed myself and as I hear reported back, and I think also at this plenary session as well. And I think that these kind of issues are worth reflecting on and worth discussing because they provide a greater insight into various issues, including understanding international financial institutions as intergovernmental organizations and understanding why they are special in many respects, both in legal and political terms. And I think that the questions about membership are also useful for us to reflect on, because the international financial institutions wouldn't exist unless the members decided to create them. So it's good for us to talk about the kind of questions which we've examined, because it gives us a greater understanding about motivations behind the establishment of the international financial institutions. And that's important because international financial institutions need to constantly demonstrate their value to the members. And the main way in which they do that is by ensuring their relevance and ensuring that they're able to deliver on the mandate that has been set for them and as reflected in their charter and as given greater flesh by corporate strategies and medium-term objectives and the like. So thank you very much for the time today.